to Top 5, a show where we sit down and, I guess, rank things.
Yeah.
I guess.
Talk about them.
Yeah, talk about them. Maybe get angry at each other over things.
1 through 5, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, this week. Oh, people are listening, Matthew. We probably ought to do a show this week on Top 5. The top 5 books we've read recently. Now, I know what you're thinking in your mind there, Carl. I think these guys have done this topic before. We did 5 years ago. Maybe even 6 years ago. It's 5 or 6 years ago that we did this topic. So
William Buck Rogers came back 5 years later.
I figured over the course of 5 years, we have probably read 5 books. And so we could do things that we've done recently.
So.
Really? Do you not read books that often?
I don't read books. I read a lot of digital stuff, and I read a lot of, online, and I read tons and tons of comics. But I'm like, well, what actual bookity books, or even like Kindle-y books have I read? So I have 5.
I mean, Kindle books is a book. Audiobooks are a book.
But you got to remember, I can't listen to audiobooks when I'm at work.
No, but you can in the car.
Home.
You can in the car.
When can I listen in the car?
Oh, how long does it take you to get to work?
14 minutes.
That's 14 minutes a book.
I'm talking to my wife.
Talking's overrated.
No,
you see your wife all the time. You can talk to her anytime.
Shut up.
So I actually read a lot of books. I will say that 2020 has not been a good year for me reading books. But typically I read anywhere between 50 and 70 books a year. And so what I thought I would do is, for my top 5 books that I've read recently, I'm only going to do the most recent 5 books. I'm not going to count, these aren't my favorite books that I've read over the last 5 years. These are just going to be my most recent 5 books that I've read. And in fact, from the time that I wrote this list on Saturday, Matthew, to the time that we are recording this, I actually have read 2 more books that I had to amend my list. So what do you have for number 5? I'm curious.
Dork. My number 5 is actually a Christmas gift, as are many of the physical books on this list. In fact, with the exception of one, I think they're all Christmas gifts. But my number 5 is actually a book that my wife gave me that is really, really fascinating in a way of, I kind of knew that, but not necessarily from that perspective. My number 5, Marvel Year by Year of Visual History.
Oh, yeah.
It is one of those huge coffee table books that you can use it to kill pests in the house and carry it around and throw it at people. You could be a superhero. You could be Bookman. But it has a lot of really cool imagery. Not as many stories. It's not like, Marvel the Untold Story, where it's all things you didn't know about Stan Lee's mustache.
Mm-hmm.
But it has a lot of really interesting behind-the-scenes information. You'll see some original art, really huge reproductions of things like the Hulk Hulk Annual #1 with that Steranko cover where the Hulk is bending over and holding the logo, or the breakdown of the Black Widow in her first appearance in her shiny John Romita catsuit. And it's fascinating to look at this. And then about 1992, it all just goes straight to HE double hockey sticks. But they commit. They're like, we're going to show you something important from 1994. Have you heard of Night Watch? And it's just, it's a book that I really enjoy simply because of my amateur historian comic booky status, where I'm like, oh, yeah, I kind of forgot that happened because of this, or that, Wonder Man's first appearance was actually not his first appearance. It's technically his second appearance. All of these things that happened, and all of these bits and pieces, really large, really, really well printed and massive compared to the actual comics themselves. So I really enjoyed it. It's a nice Christmas gift, and I read it, and I'm like, oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, cool. So the most recent 5th book that I have read is Wanderers, a novel from Chuck Wendig. And I actually started this in January, and it is a story about a girl whose sister suddenly becomes a catatonic zombie, more or less. Sleepers is what they are. They're alive. They are mobile. They can wander around. They can move. You just can't connect with them. And if you try to poke them with a needle, their skin is super, super solid and it'll break the needle. And as the story progresses, there's just this huge group of wanderers that are going somewhere. We don't know where. And then suddenly we start to piece together why and what's happening with these people in relation to the rest of the world, because turns out this book isn't about some scary group of people wandering around and the people who are trying to figure it out and the lives that they touch along the way. No, this is a story about a global pandemic that kills 99% of the population.
Oh, that sounds depressing.
Not only, I mean, it really does get depressed. So I think a lot of people will take Wanderers and instantly compare it to The Stand, because there are a lot of parallels between what happens with Captain Trips in Stephen King's novel and what's going on with the white, I forget what they call it here, White Death or whatever it is, in Wanderers.
The White Shadow.
Yeah, but the thing that makes this such a hard read was that Wendig actually went through, you can tell he did his research on how pandemics spread and how stuff comes out of caves infected by bats and infects people. And you pick this book up and you start reading it in January and you're like, oh, okay, I'm reading this here and there. La, 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 la. It's kind of interesting, kind of creepy in places. This feels like something that could happen today. And then we hit February. And pretty much everything that he talks about as far as global pandemics go play out in real time in the United States and the rest of the world. And I literally had to stop reading this book because it became so prophetic in so many different places that I was freaked out and even more depressed and even more upset about what was going on in this book. And, you know, finally, and I didn't read anything. I mean, this is a book that made me say, you know what, I'm done reading for a while. And it took me almost 2 months before I said, you know what, I'm going to go back. I'm going to finish this book. I need to know what happens. And I hope it doesn't end the way that The Stand ends, because I still think that is one of the 10 worst endings of all time.
I didn't like the ending.
Well, it's a Stephen King book. What'd you expect?
Right. That's actually one of the best parts of it. Part 2 is Stephen King actually shows up and tells his surrogate in the story, yeah, that ending sucked.
But I did pick it up and I did make it all the rest of the way through. But I will say, and it's a very good book. Okay, it's a very good book. But here's the thing: if you are someone that is extremely disturbed by the events of COVID-19, this is a book you don't want to read. I'm giving you this right now because it is so, like I said, prophetic as far as how the disease was spreading. And again, I'm reading this in January and February, as the disease is coming out of China and as it's spreading around the rest of the world. And we're seeing, you know, people dying by the tens of thousands around the world, that this is a book that will trigger you. Okay. And so I just want you to be aware of that. If you're someone who doesn't believe that the COVID virus exists, well, I feel sorry for you. You probably have difficulty reading, and I probably would not suggest reading Wanderers. But for the rest of the world that understands what a pandemic is, and maybe you want some of that grippy fear going on, then definitely Wanderers by Chuck Wendig is a good book to pick up.
If you want to contextualize your anxiety into a fictional setting.
Oh, yeah.
Which sometimes does help.
This is definitely it. This is definitely it. So, Matthew, what do you have for your number 4?
My number 4 is remarkably a book that I picked up almost exactly 5 years ago. And again, you know, I keep saying, oh, I don't read a lot of books. I read a lot of stuff. I read things, but I don't necessarily sit down and read a book. But when one of my colleagues and co-hosts writes a book, I'm like, hey, I'm going to read it. My number 4 is The Tale of Tallest Rabbit, written by our own Rodrigo. And it's one of those books that I enjoy because I remember being 12 and 13 and reading the books for people slightly above my level and going, hey, what's this all about? Reading things like, you know, The White Mountains and Invasion of the Body Snatchers and the weird Ray Bradbury crazy stuff, and even Harlan Ellison, which don't do that if you're 12. Good Lord. It'll mess you up. You'll end up like me. But I like The Tale of Tallest Rabbit because it's truly an all ages book. It's one of those books where you can just go, hey, I enjoy this on a level as both, you know, a former child and as an adult. There's things in there for everyone. My wife introduced it to her book club. The kid loved it. She was like, oh man, this is great. And she specifically, when I was putting together this top 5, it's always a family thing, we're like, hey, what should I do for top 5? And they're like, here's some bad ideas and also one that you might want. But Widget was immediately like, yep, you got to do Tale of Tallest Rabbit. I'm like, was that in the last 5 years? She's like, December of 2015. It's exactly within. And so that's why it's my number 4.
There you go. My number 4 is by Tom Merritt. Now, you may remember, maybe even the last time we did this book, me talking about Pilot X. And if you don't know what Pilot X is someone who pilots a ship. They don't have names. They only have titles. X is his name. Pilot is his designation. And he is someone that comes from a planet where time travel is possible. And time travel is possible because you can get into this, what looks like a little tiny ship, which is bigger on the inside, and you can go through time and space, and you can have adventures and solve problems and save the universe, or in the case of Pilot X, destroy the universe. Which leads us to my number 4, Trigger, the follow-up to Pilot X, also by Tom Merritt, where we pick up almost immediately after the universe has been destroyed, or shortly after, to find out what Pilot X has been up to, and he finds out that the device that destroyed the universe, someone is working on a device to destroy the new universe. And so he goes in search for that. He also goes in search for Pi and a bunch of other things inside of a ship that, I don't know, it's no secret. It is the TARDIS, and Pilot X is the Doctor. Tom just doesn't say those things. But you can tell that this is definitely a Doctor Who adventure. And if the BBC would ever pick up these books and read them, I think they would say, hey, we should give this Tom Merritt guy a crack at writing a Doctor Who story, because I think he could do a really good job of it. Tom says you can read these books in any order because of the timey-wimey nature of the story. But honestly, I think you need to read Pilot X first and then Trigger. But Trigger is the one that I've read most recently of these two. Definitely a book worth picking up. And that's why it is on my number 4.
Nice.
Yeah, what do you have for number 3 there, Matthew?
My number 3 is a book that I bought to assuage my disappointment at one of the worst decisions of my adult life.
Is that coming and working for me?
I will smack you. Not everything is about you.
No, I'm just saying, was it the worst decision you made was coming to work for me? This is the point where you can do some negging and finally agree with me on something. And all that stuff.
You might be top 5. But, hey, we've got a title drop. My number 3 goes back to the year either 2003 or 2004. The local Topeka Theater here in town occasionally will have like a big deal person come to town. And they've had a lot of big deal people. They've had a comedian that we don't talk about anymore, and they had a writer that we don't talk anymore. And, we had a bunch of people come through, and one of the people who came through was George Carlin.
Oh, man.
And I didn't go.
Oh, man.
For a number of reasons, I didn't go. Now, remember, this is 2004. George passed away in 2008, I think. And I still just hate the fact that I didn't go. So a few years ago, after the fact, because it came out like literally the year he passed away, I realized that George had written his own autobiography, which had been published posthumously. It's called Last Words, and it's my number 3. And it's literally George telling the story of his life, starting with his conception. And he actually makes the joke that he was raised Catholic, and that's why. And literally all the way through his life. And he passed away like either during or immediately after completing the book. He finished this book, and then he died. So I got this just a few years ago, and I read it, and it is heartbreaking and funny, and it's deep. It's weirdly deep. Even if you're used to George doing that stuff where he's like, here's a joke with an F-bomb in it, and now I'm going to unravel your world with the thought process behind it. Even if you're used to hearing him talk about things like Kansas, one of the square states, we'll put a fence around it, we'll throw all the criminals and let them fight it out on pay-per-view. And I'm just like, yeah, okay. It's my state. It's not a very good one. He's right. It's just one of the square ones in the middle. But Last Words really, really got to me. And I've read it 3 or 4 times since then. It's one of the most recent things that I've actually looked at. Right before my last move, I was like, oh, man, I need to look at this. And then I realized I couldn't find the dust jacket. I'm like, oh, crap, where'd I put the dust jacket? and I found a stack of dust jackets like 15 high. I'm like, oh man, now I got to put these on the books.
Yeah.
But George is one of the major influences for me on the way that I look at life and the way I try to understand things. Not necessarily, the latest late period George, who was cynical to the point of frightening, but the arc of his life, going from the hippy dippy weatherman to the guy who's very incisive about everything, to the guy who reminds you that everything sucks one way or the other. All of that makes perfect sense. And the older I get, the more I feel like George knew something that I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, every year I'm going to be 190 and be going, if I knew at 175 what I know now. By the way, I'm just going to live forever. That's the plan. But
good luck with that.
Yeah.
Also, you want to know something real weird? I was flipping through YouTube videos the other day, and I came across this George Carlin, Merv Griffin thing that he did in like 1965, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it is weird to watch because he comes out and he is clean shaven, short hair, wearing a business suit, and it's just
like a suit and tie, doing his stand up.
Who is this? This isn't George Carlin. And then he opens his mouth and you're like, oh my God, this is George Carlin. And then and then the video right after that is like 1966 or 1967. And he's gone full on hippie at that point. Yep. And it's just weird to see that before and after, because I think everybody knows George Carlin from that hippie trippy guy. Right. But when you see him clean cut, you're just like, wow, that is crazy. So does he address that in his book about when he went from clean cut to the crazy hippie?
Yep. He talks about his days teaming with Jack and all of the things that happened. And then he talks about the slow transition. There's actually a really fascinating bit where he talks about one line in one album that I've always loved, where he just all of a sudden starts off the cuff spinning this silly story on ice. I used to be water. And he talks about this and he's like, this is a very important moment to me, because I was looking at this and I'm like, this could be a whole new career. This could be George Carlin, the comic who does the stream of consciousness stuff that no one else thinks of. And I'm like, my God, that would have been awesome. And he's like, and then I decided not to. I'm like, damn it, George. Why? But yeah, it's really, really good stuff. I do recommend it if you can get it. It's probably available.
Yeah. My number 3 book is Night Shift Dragons by Rachael Aaron. Now, Night Shift Dragons is the 3rd book in the Detroit Free Zone book series, the Minimum Wage Magic series, which in itself is a spin-off of a series called Heartstrikers. But you don't have to read Heartstrikers, which I never did, and I don't think I have an interest in doing it. This is a standalone series, but I read the first 2 books of this like a year or so ago, and I was really waiting for the 3rd book to show up because book 2 ends in a cliffhanger, and I was like, oh no! Is there going to be a book 3? And sure enough, the book 3 just dropped like last month, as of this recording. So I think this was March is when it dropped. And I was like, yeah, heck yeah, I'm going to buy this book. It is Night Shift Dragons. And Night Shift Dragons, the minimum wage book or the Detroit Free Zone book, tells the story of a girl named Opal Young-A, who this is a book that is in the future where AI and technology is a big deal. It's also a book or a series where the gig economy is in full effect. And Opal is a cleaner. She goes around and she takes abandoned apartment buildings or apartments or people that are, haven't paid their rent, and she goes in and cleans them, and she gets to keep anything that she finds in them. In fact, the way she goes and finds these apartments is she has to bid on them. And you bid on these based on what you see in the pictures, and then you go in and then you find whatever you can, and then you can auction that off, and that's how you make your money. Why would she do this? She's a college educated person. Well, she is trying to get out of debt under her father, who is the Great Dragon of Korea. Yeah. And through the course of the books, we learn why it's called the Detroit Free Zone is because suddenly a god awakened beneath Detroit and was fed up with all the crap that was going on and banished all the bad people and all the bad gods out of Detroit and said, this is my city. You can do whatever you want here. It's a free will zone. People can do and live and make their monies however they can. So Opal, because of her use of magic, has migrated to the Detroit Free Zone, and she's trying to get out of her father's thumb. And through the course of multiple books, we find out why Opal hates her family. Now, Opal is a girl, a female girl. The Dragon of Korea is a dragon. You can figure out in the book, or they tell you in the book, how that's possible. And in the third book, we really see a reconciliation between father and daughter. Stubborn father and daughter who just wants to be able to make her own choices, love who she wants to love, do what she wants to do, and the father who eventually softens by the end of the book. I think it's a really cool book series. These are some people may not like it, but I found it incredibly enjoyable. I'm glad that the third book is done. I kind of wish there was a fourth book, but Rachael Aaron, who I follow on Twitter, did say that this is the third and final book in the series, which I do see that happening a lot with books these days, where you will get a 3-book series. Our good friend Bill Schweigert has a 3-book series where the main character follows cryptids throughout the world, but primarily in the New Jersey area. So this one is a 3-book series too. So that is Night Shift Dragons by Rachael Aaron. Really enjoyed it. I think if you're wanting to see or try to get a better idea of what people mean by the gig economy, what it means to be a daughter of or someone who grows up in a very traditional Asian family, I think this book covers that fairly well based on the experiences that I have seen and experienced myself. And then also it's got magic and dragons and fighting and good guys and bad guys and all that stuff. So that's why it made my number 3. And well, it also made my number 3 because it's the third most recent book that I have read. Matthew, what do you got?
Are we putting them in order? I wasn't.
Well, no, you can put them in any order. That's why I said at the beginning that these are the 5 most recent books that I have read in the last 5 years. If we went back and I had to go back through, 300 books that I've read over the last 5 years and pick my top 5, that would be nearly impossible.
Right.
So that's why I'm just going with the 5 most recent that I have read. And I think these are all good books. I don't think that there is a book here that I have finished reading and said, well, my number 1 might be that way, but I think it has some redeeming values there. I've never read a book where at the end of it, I was like, except for Oil by Sinclair Lewis, which I hated. By the time I got to that and the ending just went, I was like, screw this book. I'm never reading Sinclair Lewis ever again. But Night Shift Dragons.
No Country for Old Men. It's fine.
Well, that's what it's based on, right? Except it's based on like the first chapter of Oil. That's a longer discussion that I've had before. Yeah, just read the first chapter. That's all you need. After that, it goes off in a totally different direction from the movie. So there you go. Matthew, what do you have for your? I think we're up to our number 2s.
My number 2.
Your number 2, please.
Kids, it's one of those times where if you're under the age of 25, you're going to have to ask your parent or an older person what in the world I'm talking about. When you think of the cartoon where Bugs Bunny is standing and there's an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other, whispering in his ears, trying to tell him what to do. If you say that, without a value judgment, that devil, that cynical voice is George whispering in my left ear, then you have to look at the other shoulder and you will find a more wholesome, less cynical, but equally dark and funny voice whispering in my right ear. And that voice is Alfred Yankovic. And so my number 2 is Weird Al, the book by Nathan Rabin and Weird Al Yankovic. And it's another example of something where an autobiography doesn't necessarily have to be a boring recitation of facts and timelines. It doesn't have to be, and then I graduated and went off to work in the Peace Corps. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, there are stories that are just riveting that are told entirely straightforward. Weird Al, the book, is more of a multimedia experience. It's freaky and it's strange, and it's exactly what you'd expect from the man who literally perfected pop culture parody, to the point where every time, back in the days of LimeWire and downloads, every time there was a parody song, it would be attributed to a misspelled Weird Al. Doesn't matter what it was. If it's gross, if it's awful, it's terrible. If it's not funny, it's all from Weird Al. W-I-E-R-D. And that's how you knew it was fake. But this book, which I think I got like 4 years ago, but may have come out several years before that, This book is really, really funny. And it's written by Nathan Rabin. And if you know nothing else about Nathan Rabin, you know that Nathan Rabin came up with the phrase manic pixie dream girl. And he feels really bad about it. So imagine the thought process that created that description of a very familiar trope and redesigned the way we talk about these movies. Now imagine that pointed at Weird Al, who's a frickin' genius. You can tell me, oh, is he really? He rewrites other people's songs. Yes, he does, but he does it well. And he does it artistically. And there are songs of his that are parodies of things that you didn't know. I tell this story, but maybe a year and a half ago, I was sitting in the car and I realized that Mr. Popeil from the 1982 album Weird Al in 3D is a parody of the B-52s. Not a particular song, not, something famous they did. It is literally a parody of the career, the style, the je ne sais quoi that constitutes the B-52s. And it's so good and so subtle that it took me 30 years to pick up on it. And that, my friends, in a book is why you should read Weird Al the book, my number 2 book that I've read in the last 5 years.
Nice.
Yeah.
My number 2 book that I just finished a week ago, a few days ago. I think it was like Saturday or Sunday of this week.
Wait, as of this week? Or
yeah, as of this recording,
airing?
as of the week of this book, the week of this
Hello,
recording.
Slightly in the future, people.
Yeah, and this might be, I think this is maybe 2 or 3 weeks from now, so who knows. But it's a book that I've read, haven't read before, but I've read little bits and pieces, and I've, had discussions about it or listened to discussions about it. It is a book that's told in a nonlinear order. It starts with Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time or lost in time, and it ends with Peter Whoop. It is Slaughterhouse-Five from Kurt Vonnegut. This is, when you listen to or when you read the first, I don't know if it's really the introduction. It's kind of the first chapter where Kurt Vonnegut is going around and talking about how he wanted to write a book about the bombing of Dresden and the horrors of war, and going and talking with his friend who he was also a prisoner of war with in Dresden during the bombings and everything, and trying to figure out what is the best way to tell this story. And then you find out that the narrator of Billy Pilgrim's story is in fact Kurt Vonnegut, who kind of plays a very minor role in this. We learn the life of Billy Pilgrim and how he becomes unstuck in time and how he was abducted by the Tralfamadorians or whatever their names are. Tralfamadorians. Yeah, something like that. And, the things that happens to his life in a very nonlinear fashion, you find out what these moments are meaningful in Billy's life. You try to pull some meaning from this, but we also see that Billy's life is very tragic from beginning to end. And had this story been told linearly, it probably would not have been as interesting. And so when you kind of tear up scenes and you throw them up in the air and you just, whatever order they land in, that's how you tell the story, I think makes this really interesting. Memento, the movie, would not be interesting told in beginning to end order. Instead, it's being told from the end to the beginning. When it's told from the end to the beginning, it's a very interesting movie. It's thrilling. You're wondering what's going to happen next. When you watch Memento from beginning to end, it's a very boring movie about a very horrible person doing things really bad to a man who has a mental disorder, who has a mental disorder, I guess, is brain damage, I guess is the word that I want to use here. And I think the same is true with Billy Pilgrim. Here's a person who has some brain damage, has some post-traumatic stress, maybe some schizophrenia going on, and how he reconciles all of this. And we are presented with this in a very nonlinear fashion. But through the process, we get the story of the bombing of Dresden and the impact that it had on everybody. And because we're viewing it through Billy Pilgrim's life, and then we also know that Kurt Vonnegut is a character in Billy Pilgrim's concentration camp, we get to understand what the meaning is to Kurt Vonnegut and to other World War II veterans that have gone through the horrors of war. If you've never read Slaughterhouse-Five, I would suggest that you do so. I think it's an interesting book in the sense of sci-fi and time travel and what are the horrors of war. I know this book is about to be adapted into a comic book for, I believe, Boom Studios, and I think they're going to do it in the same way that they did Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, where they basically take the text from the book 100% without editing it, slapped together with pictures and then run it over a multiple series. I think that's what they're going to do with this. I also believe that there's another movie. There was a movie done, I want to say in like late 70s, early 80s. I think they're getting ready to do another movie of Slaughterhouse-Five. So now might be a good time to pick up this book and read about the adventures of Billy Pilgrim, his time in the war, his time as an optician, right? What's the ophthalmologist? That's the eye doctor.
Ophthalmologist?
Yeah. Optician, yes. As well as his time being captured by an alien race that looks like a plunger with a hand on top and an eye in the center. So that's Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. You've read that book before, right, Matthew?
Yeah, I want to say I read it in high school.
Yeah.
That's been a while ago.
Yeah. All right, we have made it to our number ones. So Matthew, please share.
So it goes.
And so it goes. So Matthew, please share with us your number one book that you have read recently.
My number one, surprising no one, is another Christmas gift. This one I think I got in 2017. But more importantly, it is a book that spurred a really important conversation that never actually got finished. I'm really sad about it. But nonetheless, it is a collection of short fiction by one of my favorite authors who's really good at short fiction. I don't have any of his big novels to speak of, but I have every single one of Stephen King's short story collections. The latest one, The Bazaar of Bad Dreams, is exactly what it says on the tin, because this is a truly disturbing series of stories. Sometimes you'll get like if you read Stephen King's Everything's Eventual, there are a couple of funny stories in there. There's one that's really tragic that's actually a fictionalized account of the last days of John Dillinger that's really, really good. I recommend it to anyone who wants to see it. But if you start The Bazaar of Bad Dreams, you start with Mile 81, which is a novella which has a lot in common with his story From a Buick 8, if you've ever read that one.
No.
But it ends terribly. And then we get to, we transition to things like Bad Little Kid, where a man is tortured by the same bully throughout his life. And this bully is always an 11-year-old kid in a beanie. And this kid shows up and murders everyone he loves throughout his life. And it ends on this ambiguous note. And then there's one about avatars of death, how everyone sees their own avatar. So when you die, you'll get your own avatar. And the main character of the book ambiguously ends by seeing someone that he thinks is his avatar of death. There's Summer Thunder, which is a post-apocalyptic story of a man who decides to go out on his own terms. But probably the most horrifying thing in it is a story called Obits, where a man jokingly writes an obituary for someone he doesn't like, and that person dies. And he gets a job writing obituaries for the paper, and he writes another joke obituary, and that person dies. And then he writes another joke obituary, and he realizes that not only did that person die, but several other people with that same name. And oh my God, it is such a dark story. It is so, so horrifying. And if you, like I do, like to sublimate your terror and anxiety into a horrifying story that you can then, ball up, throw over your shoulder, and bark like a dog, which is what these books are really, really good for.
Mm-hmm.
You're anxious, you're upset, you're mad about stuff. You read this story, bad things happen to bad people, and you go, man, at least I wasn't eaten by a Cthulhian monstrosity. And you feel better. And that is why I recommend The Bazaar of Bad Dreams. I actually recommend all of King's short fiction, especially Everything's Eventual, which is what gave us 1408, that movie with John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I also recommend Skeleton Crew, which is old school in all the best ways.
That's like one of his first collections of short stories, right?
That's from like 1980, I think. Skeleton Crew, I think, is his second. Night Shift is his first.
Mm-hmm.
Then Skeleton Crew. I remember my friends passing around Skeleton Crew and going, tee-hee, there's bad words in here.
and what, 4 seasons after that?
14.
Or the Bachman books or whatever after that?
The Bachman books is actually 4 novellas. That's a very, very good one. I wouldn't call that a short story, but yeah. The Bachman books is fascinating because one of them is out of print now for a very good reason. And then Different Seasons is the one where 3 of the 4 stories have become huge movie hits.
Yeah.
Because
Stand
Shawshank
by
Redemption
Me,
is in
Shawshank
there,
Redemption.
Stand By Me, and then Apt Pupil,
Mm-hmm.
which had Brad Renfro and Sir Ian Magneto, which is a lesser known but still pretty solid film.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's a fourth piece that nobody could ever make into a movie. And if they ever try, I will go and see it. And I will go, I told you this is why you couldn't make it into a movie.
All right. My number one is actually a recommendation of one of my students. We have a discussion in one of my classes that, if you want to be a creator, doesn't matter whether you want to be a writer, whether you rather want to be a film director, if you want to be talent, doesn't matter. You enrich yourself by reading books. And the more books that you can read, the more stuff you can absorb about culture, the more stuff that you can read about things that you're interested in or things that you want to pursue. If you want to write horror, or you want to work in, some genre of horror, then read as many horror books as you can. Watch as many horror movies as you can. And so I had asked the students, what are some books that you have read recently? Just to see if they were reading books. And one of my students said, hey, I just, one of my favorite books that I read, and I've read it probably 5 or 6 times, is the book Supermarket by Bobby Hall. And he recommended it. I was like, oh, okay, this, he talked about a guy who wants to be a writer who goes to work at a supermarket and things go weird is kind of, I think, how he pitched it to me. And I was like, oh, okay, this sounds really interesting. And, I want to be in touch with the times. I want to be hip with what the kids are reading these days. It's by Bobby Hall, who is also apparently a musician by the name of Logic. I don't think I've heard any of his music. But I decided now that I was done with Slaughterhouse-Five that I would get to a recommendation by one of my students, again, just a few months ago, probably, I think it was right before everything shut down because of coronavirus. I had added it to my list, so it would be late February when I picked this up and just got around to reading it. And it's really about a 3-day read, a couple hours here, a couple hours there. You can get it done in about 3 days. But it is a story about a guy who goes to work at a supermarket so he can get information, so he can write his book. And he meets a lot of interesting characters there, including a guy named Frank. And I don't want to spoil it too much for you, but this is the book I was probably the most disappointed in, only because this book feels like, I don't want to use YA as a dismissive, but it feels like, and the main character is like 20 or 30s, late 20s, early 30s. So it's not like, he's got to be late 20s. Yeah, he's, not even out of college. Didn't go to college. But it feels like that younger, hipper version of Fight Club. And it also feels like it's smashed together with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So if you've read both of those books, or if you've seen both of those movies, you will know everything that pops up in Supermarket. The minute that it pops up, you're like, oh, this is what's going to happen here. And this is what's going to happen here. And sure enough, it plays out exactly like you think it is. And if you know what Fight Club is about, and you know what One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is about, then you know everything you need to know about what Supermarket is about. Now, I think this is well written. Okay. Better than what I've written. I'll say that. But it's also very predictable to people who are savvy. So if you are someone that's like, ooh, I'll never read an old book like Fight Club, or ooh, I don't watch old movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Ooh, that stuff's for old people. I'm young and I'm hip. Well, then go read Supermarket by Bobby Hall. Did I enjoy the book? I enjoyed it. Yes. Did I enjoy it as much as the other books on my list? No. Would I recommend it to a lot of other people? Not if you're savvy. But if you're wanting to know what the young kids are into these days, then yeah, maybe. So again, these aren't the best books that I've read in the last 5 years. These are the 5 most recent books that I have read. Now, there are two others that are not on this list at the time of this recording, because one is a short story by Joe R. Lansdale. Let me see if I can find it real quick. It's called It's called Vale's Visit. It is a novella or a short story set in the Hap and Leonard universe, where the two are in jail for once again trying to burn down the crack house next door to Leonard's house, and the lawyer who comes down and gets them out of jail. I kind of read that as a lead in to the new Hap and Leonard story that just came out this last week from Joe R. Lansdale. I really enjoy his writing. The other one that I'm right in the middle of, and I think literally I have 2 chapters left in, is Damn Fine Story by Chuck Wendig, who started my list. And it is a book on writing, his idea of what it means to be a writer and how you craft stories and what you should be thinking about when you're crafting stories and those kinds of things. One of the other books that I've read within the last 6 months is Stephen King's On Writing, which is a fantastic book. And if you want to be a writer, Stephen King's On Writing is great. If you're a fan of Stephen King, I would also recommend that book because the first half of it is biography of him in his own words, talking about, here's how I became a writer. Here's how things happened. It goes all the way up to, at least in the 10th anniversary collection that I read, it goes right up to the point where he was struck by that car along the road.
A smooth criminal.
Yes. And about a year after his recovery. And then he goes into the mechanics of writing. The 20th anniversary of Stephen King's On Writing is about to be released or just released. And it features a foreword by Joe Hill and his other son, Owen King. Yeah. So it's got 2 introductions by his 2 kids. So, those are some books to read. But that is the one I was almost done with it today, but I didn't get to it. So that would mean that I read 3 books in the last week and a half. But those are the 5 most recent books. Usually by the end of the year, I don't know if I put this on. I don't think I did it for 2019 up on the Major Spoiler site just because we live in a crap timeline right now. But towards the end of the year over at majorspoilers.com, I will post a list of all the books that I read in the past year and sometimes a few thoughts on those books, even if it's just a one sentence review of the book. So be on the lookout for that at the end of the year. And if you're someone who loves reading books, hopefully this might give you some other books to check out. I certainly have a lot more books on the way, and I think because I will finish Chuck's book probably tomorrow, the Damn Fine Story. Oh yeah, I'm just got a few. There are just a few after that. After that, the next one up is Lev Grossman's Warp, which it's Warp, which was the novel that he wrote before he wrote The Magicians. And so a lot of people are like, oh, if you read this and you know about the Magicians, then you will see him laying the groundwork for what The Magicians will be, which is the big series of magic users in college. So I'm going to be reading that next. And if I look at my list, let me go here. If anybody cares, do you have some other books that you have, Matthew?
Oh, no.
No, that's it? All right. Well, let me just go through here then. And let me find the next. I can tell you the next books that I'm reading.
Okay.
Let's see. The Obstacle is the Way. The Life and Times of Prince Albert, which is, I don't know anything about that book except it's a freebie.
I know he spent a lot of time in the can.
A Long Time Ago in a Cutting Room. It's all about editing by Paul Hirsch. How to Have Impossible Conversations. Influence. 1 Million Followers. Tiny Habits. True Detective. Let's see. Cut and Run, which I don't know what it's on my. Oh, that's an Acker and Blacker book. So that's I like those guys from their show that they used to do. True Indie is on my list. And then I'm really interested in 2 more series that kind of fall into this fantasy setting. Interview with the Robot, which I believe is the first book in an ongoing series. And let's see if I can find the other one. 3 Mages and a Margarita is another modern day magic fantasy series. And I'll want to read the first book on that, see if it's any good. And then, because we haven't got another Jim Butcher Dresden Files book in forever, I'm going to read Jim Butcher's Spider-Man, The Darkest Hours. So Jim Butcher wrote a Spider-Man book, and I'm going to read that. So those are the next series of books on my list. Maybe some others will slip in there if something really pops up and grabs my attention. I was really hoping that new Happen Leonard book was going to be available in audio form, but it is not yet, and so that angers me. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. All right, what books are on your list? What are the books that you have read recently? Are they fantasy? Are they mystery? Are they horror, biography, self-help? What are they? We want to know. Matthew wants to know. Everybody in our Discord server wants to know. So get over there and share with them, and they will share with you. Why? Because everybody loves to read, and everybody loves a list.
This podcast is copyright 2020 by Major Spoilers Entertainment, LLC.